Hello, it's February 3rd, 2017. I'm Tony Smario, coming to you from my father, BroSal.org YouTube channel. And, I've been meaning to do a Bible study and get back to the book of Job. And there's a small group of people that are following that. And I've been distracted quite a bit the last couple of months, not least of all with this inauguration and all the transition that's going on that I see right now has got me sort of caught up in some of the details and getting excited about all the hype. And so the Bible study takes a little more effort. The commentaries on the end times trendings and the World War III this week are a little easier for me to make a few notes based on what I'm seeing day in and day out, and then just do some commentary on it to tell you what I see. But the Bible study takes a little more study and consideration and more time. And I've been distracted, and I'm trying to work on this metaphysics of love. And that's what I kind of wanted to, I think it crosses over. When I was thinking about Job, I realized that, here you have a poetic angle, an allegorical possibly. Why, the Christianity I grew up in imagines every word written in every book that's in the King James Bible, was written by God. And Job is an especially odd instance of that. Ecclesiastes, Solomon's practically desperately pessimistic in most of his thoughts in that. They don't reflect much of what gets reconciled later through the Messiah, anyway. So, Solomon doesn't preach about loving your neighbor being the highest thing. He just says all life is futile. You can have all the women, build all the castles, have all the money, have all the power, and still you're miserable in the end because you're just going into the grave and it's all over. So if anything, Solomon's reflections are a little more like Job's in the sense of just being satisfied with your lot, that what God gives you is simply whatever your ability to be satisfied today. It's the best you got. You can't take any of it with you, so all the stress to build more and have more is really further from God. But anyway, the fact that Christians imagine all these words were written by God is a little odd now that, I've spent a few years studying it for myself. And so one of the things I find that Christianity truly misunderstands is the concept of heaven and hell. Of course, believers are going to heaven, and everybody else is going to hell. And some time ago, I think when we started this ministry, or when I started contributing to Dad's ministry about a year and a half ago, I think one of the first things we started talking about was this metaphysics of love, as it was striking me then in regard to the Christian concept of hell and heaven as well. But I don't recall heaven as clear an idea on heaven as I do now. But hell, we went over, I researched all the scriptural references to it that we have and pointed out that, if anything, it seems to be an allegory that Jesus used. The word was Gehenna. It was the fire pit on the side of the city, Jerusalem, where it never went out because that's the fire. The city was big enough. The refuse was always being burned. People were always carrying, and they didn't have garbage trucks, I suppose, to come around. And maybe they had the garbage mule, but garbage was always being carried to this fire that was always burning. That's Gehenna, not some lake of fire, hell. That's not the same word. What Jesus said, and he said it to the Pharisees, was, you're sons of this fire that doesn't go out. And you should fear the one who can not only kill your body, but can throw your soul away in the garbage, in Gehenna. I mean, that's what it really says to me when you reflect on how did Jesus use this word. Did anyone go threatening? Did anyone threaten the world? If you don't believe in Jesus, you're going to Gehenna. No. That's not what any of it says. It says you'll all be judged by your works. We will all be judged by our works. Every single man and woman will be judged by their works. That's what it says. So I'd worry about what works they're talking about. But yeah, believers are going to heaven. Everybody else is going to hell. So Christians are, have this drastic misunderstanding, which I'm happy to concede has been a planted manipulation, like the rest of our drastic misunderstandings about America being a free country, a great country, a prosperous country. Not for the people who do all the work, it's not. They keep getting less and less. Anyway, the subject I want to talk about today is the metaphysics of love, what that means in regards to our concept of heaven. Because Christians talk about heaven like it's a Club Med in the sky. And we should explode that vision, because that can't be what heaven is. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, what is heaven? And I want to approach this from a metaphysical standpoint today, because I want to regard for a moment or allow all the Scripture to be as allegorical or as poetical or as actual as it needs to be, or I want to let it find its place by looking at the story from a different angle, which is a metaphysical. Let's look at the metaphysical opportunity of existence. These are things that should really be, every young person by 10 or 12 years old would be interested in these things. But I think we don't teach it for a reason. And I think one of those reasons is so that we don't understand the concept of infinity. Because if heaven is something, heaven must be infinity. And we teach our kids, I think we even teach, all of our students of life, a real false concept, as far as I've been able to discover metaphysically, with the idea of time and space. We're happy to concede now that all time is in some grander scheme in which it's all coexistent. We use that in the modern day as a platform for philosophical nihilism and for philosophical subjectivism. We use it in the modern day to point out that everything's relative and nothing is what it seems, so that even time is just a trick. It's an illusion. Which, that's half the argument. I say life is paradoxical. And that's why I want to go through the subject matter of this metaphysics of love. Because we need to touch on a few things that are misunderstood in just the approach to the argument or the investigation of religion and supernatural spiritualism. All of that takes at least some sort of metaphysical connection with the possibilities, the relevance of metaphysics to it all, so that you don't wind up with this concept like heaven is some cube floating around in the sky like a planet, and God is some white man with a white beard sitting on his throne in this cube, judging the world from the sky. That's Zeus. That's the projection of Zeus. It's a projection of how we imagine some authority beyond our understanding, and yet being responsible, yet being one with us. How do we express that? So, the ancient people expressed it, at least in the Greeks, as these series of gods that you could name, the fates, and there were all sorts of ways to elaborate on the idea by giving caricature and, what Jung might call archetypes to these, what were certainly understandings of their own human consciousness, right? Know thyself was their great admonition. And so when I look at how we envision infinity and heaven, as a culture, especially as a Christian culture, I think, wow, we're more confused than a 10-year-old should be. Heaven can't be floating around in outer space. That's not possible. Jesus says heaven's within you. How's that? Nobody bothers to answer that. What is heaven? I say that the closest answer we can have to our conscious apprehension is heaven is the infinite. Heaven is infinity. That's why you can see your lost loved ones again, because they're not lost. Everything they ever, their birth and their death and everything, every minute of their life is still happening in heaven, in the place where what we call time does not follow based on the movement of planets and the space between them, time and space. And that's why the subject matter that needs to be understood, I think, metaphysically in discussing, a real possible heaven is to get a grasp of what we call the third dimension and why we call it that. The third dimension, what we usually call spatio-temporal reality, meaning space and time, because it takes 3 dimensions of view to be able to separate these planets one from the other, so that there is measurement of how long it takes light to get from the sun to our planet, let's say. How long it takes our planet to spin on its axis. If all these things are really going on, something's going on that gives us the impression of time passing. And that impression is caused by being in a dimension in which things exist separated from each other, and it's that space between them that gives this spatio-temporal reality its nature, where we measure time, and we measure it because there is space. And so when you start thinking about infinite, you have to start thinking about a different sort of dimensional experience. And to give you an example, I find one of the most confusing things that I learned growing up, when they teach about second dimension, third dimension, the way you learn it when you draw something. Second dimension would be a line or a square on a page. Third dimension would be turning that line or square into a cube, right? Well, that's its representation in drawing. But metaphysically, if we concede that the third dimension is this dimension of time and space that allows us to gauge anything, the passage of time or how much we weigh or how tall we are, all of this is based on this environment that's got to do with spatio-temporal relationship. The fact that there is space between things, and that space is measurable. It may not be constant in the theory of relativity, but in its own relation to space, it is constant, right? From what Einstein thought of, if you have bigger bodies moving faster in other parts of the universe, you have more gravity and a different measure of time, but the measure is still the same. That's how you know it's different. It's all being measured the same, and it's all because it's part of what I label metaphysically this third dimension. So if we were going to talk about a second dimension, we couldn't talk about a line or a square on a page, because it would take 3 dimensions just to represent 2 points in space. A line takes 3 dimensions metaphysically to represent. So what would a second dimension look like? And this is a whole nother talk, so I'm just going to give you the highlight reel. The second dimension into the third, because this would all be one existence. These wouldn't be like Russian dolls that fit one inside another. It might be like that in a certain relationship, but not a physical one. So the second dimension that becomes the third dimension would have to be the potential energy actualized, ascending into form. So that if we were to look at the second dimension metaphysically, it would look like static from here. It would look like nothingness. It would be incomprehensible, incongruent. It's nothingness. It's potential energy, which is what modern physics is trying to point it as. But they're trying to contain it all in this same third dimension of time and space. And I say it's the vision of the dimensional application that will then allow you to start asking and answering the questions properly. What is heaven, first of all? If it's infinite, what is infinite, if not timeless, timelessness, spacelessness? So how can space be infinite? How can we talk about infinite space? That's like the free market that's so controlled you have to be in a certain club just to participate. Space can't be infinite by its very definition of what it is. Space is the finite thing. Space and time are the form coming out of the potential for form. So when we talk about infinite space, we act like space just goes on and on and on forever with no beginning and no end. Well, that's a conundrum you can never get behind. Where's space come from? God made it? Well, He can't be in space if He made space. So is space more infinite? What was there first, space or God? See? So from the spiritual standpoint of thinking there's a God there first, and this is, any Hindu's going to see where I'm going with this, because this is where they get the best of their thought, in my view, realizing that Brahman, is the God behind it all, the existence, the ineffable behind it all, is responsible for space and time, not the other way around. Space isn't just existing forever. How's that possible? How do you measure it? Where does a measurement come from? So I'll spend more time on this in the part of the Metaphysics of Love that deals with the third dimension and the dimensions. But at this point, what I want to get at with what heaven is, heaven must be infinite. Infinite must be beyond space. Somehow space is contained in the infinite. So again, now, if you could see this dimensional switch, just as potentialized energy becomes form, ascends into form. If we look at the third and fourth dimensional relationship as a model, not to pretend this is, like I say, Russian dolls, but as a model, we could say that the fourth dimension then would be the organizing principle of infinite ideas, actualized into time, descended, if you will, from a principle of infinite ideas. That's the timelessness, right? So what we find, if we flesh this out, is that the infinite can only exist in mind as potential ideas. So, and this is the Brahminic twist to where I want you to imagine that they knew thousands of years ago, that it's in the mind of God that space can be infinite. And so what heaven is would seem to be the mind of God, or some relationship that brings us onto that metaphysical level. What it is a organizing principle. It's an idea. It's the energy. Okay? Now, where is heaven? Right? What is heaven? It's infinite, as opposed to time and space. It's somehow a dimension beyond form, which comes out of some formless potential energy, which also, if you think about it, leads us to, in another way, back to the void of the mind. Where does this potentialized energy to become form, if not just the void of imaginative activity that is the mind. But then the idea in the mind descends, if that's a proper analogy, as the potential of the idea ascends into form and becomes something. Okay, and this brings us to the logos, right, of God. Logos is not word. Logos is idea becoming. The idea becoming form is what logos is, an idea coming into being. And so it all starts to make sense, and this is why I call it the metaphysics of love. Because if you suddenly imagine that this mind of God is thinking about love, then the form that we know as reality is what we mistakenly call infinite space, is but the idea becoming into be. Now, in the metaphysics of love, I want to go on and explain the nature of human consciousness as the necessary apprehender of that love. But in this talk about heaven, that I'm aiming at, filling a role in the Bible study right now to give those, whoever, not just Christians. I know I have lots of different kind of people listening. So I'm hoping to offer a clearer view of what a concept of heaven might mean. And so what it is infinity. That's heaven. Where it is would seem to be, in the mind of God. Christians want to imagine this tabernacle is heaven, the cube that's described in Revelation, right? That's the tabernacle of God. That's not heaven. It says that tabernacle comes out of heaven. So people imagine it comes out of space, right? Out of the sky. But if it comes out of that heaven, that's just a way of explaining the materialization of it into form and time. But that heaven can't be where God's tabernacle is located, or God's floating around space like Zeus in his tabernacle somewhere in space. That can't be. Not metaphysically, not for me. So the tabernacle spoken of in Revelation is not heaven. It comes out of heaven. Jesus and the disciples are constantly repeating, as it is in heaven, right? The Lord's Prayer. On earth as it is in heaven. Where's heaven? Outside of space? How do you get outside of space? Only dimensionally, you guys. You can't be inside of space and be on the edge of it, on the boundary of it. How can it be infinite? So you can't have it both ways. So God's either in space, heaven's up there in the sky somewhere, in outer space on a planet, or heaven's in another dimension in which space is contained within it, just like my ideas are contained in my mind. There's all the infinite space they need. My mind's imagination is not bound, apparently, by space. It's infinite. And so if we look at love now, and this metaphysic of love being the idea becoming physical reality, then heaven must be where, the origin, the organizing principle of the idea. So in my view, from a simple metaphysical conclusion, heaven is where love exists without not love. When I explain all of the different points, paradoxical nature of existence and such, the yin-yang expression that everyone's so aware of in our modern, the deepest ideas in our modern time really just have to do with identifying, all the occult knowledge seems to be that we live in a yin-yang world. There's no good without bad, so bad's not bad, it's part of good. See, and that's true, but then is there any reconciliatory vision that is beyond good and evil, as Nietzsche says? See, they seek that reconciliatory vision in good and evil, in the paradoxical yin-yang universe, in time and space. I'm trying to suggest that the whole idea descends from a dimension that is the mind of God, that's beyond time and space, and therefore there's a reason for the nature of our reality being one of inescapable dualism, rather than just an acceptance of the inescapable dualism, right? There's a reason. That's the overcoming, right? There's a reason that good is good and bad is bad, and we cover that now in this Metaphysics of Love when we talk about subjective and objective truth and where we find those things. But each of these is meant to be now I'm going to try and do an explanation of each of them in the hopes of bringing it all together at some point into a presentation. But this one wasn't even meant, this is a little bit part of the end discussion on a spiritual connection to this metaphysic of love, what it really means. And so it's just what's I've had on my mind as I've been considering this online Bible study and what to talk about, and with the contention in the world right now, and what I believe is going to be a very heavily stimulated and fostered contention between religious and irreligious or non-religious people. I think this is something that to me is important to reflect on. These ideas of heaven and hell, like some barbaric Greek tragedy, is really not serving anyone in this time when we should be trying to love our brother and love our neighbor. That's what we need to focus on. And so, thinking of heaven as infinite, and where heaven is in the mind of God, and out of that mind comes God's tabernacle. Out of that mind comes the heaven that materializes eventually on earth when love is able to exist without its dualistic representation. In this part of creation, the experience is necessary. Love can't exist without not love existing. White can't be white unless there's something to compare it to. Good can't be good. Joy can't be joy. Everything needs something to compare it to. That's the occult knowledge that everything is meaningful in this life. And that's why it's not good and bad. But it has to be good and bad held against some other measure. And that other measure is heaven, infinite love. And so heaven must be love without not love, in the same way earth must be love with not love. And if you want to get to the scriptural prediction, it says in Revelation there's going to be a new heaven and a new earth, which in this metaphysic that I'm describing would mean to me a new idea. Heaven being this infinity of logos, God, the idea coming to be of love. A new love, perhaps, right? And a new earth meaning a new relationship to it. Not the same dualistic relationship that we've had in this past existence, where love needed to be every way to say it is incorrect. I hope you realize that. Love doesn't need anything. It's just the matter of, in the mind of God, as it exists, it then takes on its form. It exists. Doesn't even take on anything. It just simply exists. Because God thinks it exists. And what I'm trying to point out in this metaphysics of love is God thinks love, and what you have is what we see. The consciousness needed to apprehend love, which is, of course, part of love existing, is a dualistic reality of everything that is essentially not love, that gives a darkness that provides a background and an environment for the light to be known. once that light is known, the darkness can go away and the light will always be known as the light, even without the darkness. And I say that's this promise of a new heaven and a new earth, is this new earth will be, have now achieved this or become this stage of love. And there won't need to be not love. There won't need to be that same darkness. There won't need to be the same dualism. And there'll be a new idea, a new love to go with this new earth. So anyway, that's my idea of heaven at the moment. Appreciate you listening. And thanks for being here. We'll try and get back to the normal Bible study as soon as possible. I just want to, there's certain things that I feel I want to say. And my time is limited on the how much time I can invest in saying it. So anyway, thanks for being here, everybody. We'll talk to you soon. See you soon.